I'm David Rowett. I'm a partner in a boutique investment bank called Strategic Exits. And the only job that we do is that we help technology entrepreneurs sell their companies. So we're very focused, narrow bank. And we've been doing some research into new trends in the technology industry. And I was very happy that Professor Darrell asked me to come and share some of them with you. We're going to talk tonight about virtual companies and some things that we found in our research that we think make them more valuable than traditional companies. So to start, just a little bit about me. I'm an engineer by training. I did my master's right here at UBC. I went on to do an MBA at the Harvard Business School, and I've devoted all of my career to helping early stage technology become bigger companies. And in the 30 years that I've been at it, I've worked with over 70 technology companies in various positions. And now, as I said, I'm a partner with Strategic Exit Corp, helping the companies sell their business. What we're seeing is that new advanced technologies and applications, which have come to the market only in the last 5 to 10 years, they're enabling a new corporate structure called virtual companies. And they're virtual because they exist only online. You can't go to their head office because it doesn't exist. It's not there. The only way you can find them is by reaching them through an online communication system. And the virtualization of work of the offices is changing the nature of work in the 21st century and in some very profound ways. Now, as investment bankers, we're always interested in mergers and acquisitions, and so we've discovered a few things as well, that virtual companies are more valuable and easier to sell, and we'll explain why we've come to that conclusion. And we think that the impact of virtual companies is so profound that it's actually defining the fourth productivity revolution. So let me just back up and talk a little bit about that part, the productivity revolutions. You may have heard of them called the industrial revolutions, but I think once you're dealing with computers and online virtualization, it's not really industrial anymore, it's more productive. So I may use those terms interchangeably. But you've seen this graph before. It starts in 1400 in England, and it measures the GDP per capita and how it's grown over time. And what's fascinating here is that you notice for the first several hundred years, there was no growth in the economy at all, none. From the time of the fall of the Roman Empire up until the late 1700s, there was no economic growth. People lived pretty much as their grandfathers and grandmothers did, who lived as their grandparents did, and all the way back into antiquity. But long about the end of the 1700s, there were the start of 4 productivity revolutions that, as you can see, had a dramatic impact on the creation of wealth. The first revolution happened in the late 1700s when Henry Watt invented the steam engine. And that allowed the manufacturing to be done in large scale as opposed to with 2 or 3 blacksmiths in their local shop. He developed steam power to power the large machines of manufacturing. The second revolution happened late in the 1870s. 1870 to the beginning of the First World War in 1914, and that was the rapid expansion of the railways across the continent, which revolutionized transportation, and it also was the harnessing of electricity in industrial processes so that they could be automated. And that's where Henry Ford invented the assembly line for cars. The third revolution didn't happen until the 1970s with the invention of the computer, which automated many industrial processes and made workers much more efficient. And the fourth revolution, the one we're living in right now, began in 1995 with the invention of the internet and the increasing technology in mobile communications. But each paradigm change launched a new revolution in productivity and acceleration in wealth creation. And these revolutions, these paradigms changes are happening more rapidly. The fourth revolution is on us right now. Klaus Schwab, who you may recognize as the chairman of the Davos Economic Forum, which coincidentally is meeting this week in Switzerland, coincident timing, he authored a paper which he delivered at Davos 3 or 4 years ago, which talked about the ever-increasing and exponential rate of technology development, orders of magnitude bigger than what we saw in the third revolution only a few years ago. And he believed that it was going to cause the widespread disruption of established industries. And he's right. But we noticed a few other things as well, that there was a proliferation of high-speed wireless internet connections. They're almost in most people's homes, offices, coffee shops, or even in the back of buses in some places. You can't get very far in most urban settings without hitting a Wi-Fi hotspot. And what this has done has enabled billions of people to get instant access to all the information in the world. And that's pretty profound when you stop to think about it, because it wasn't too long ago that if you wanted to learn something new, you'd have to trundle down to the library. I think it's still down here at the end with the fountain in front of it too, where you used to throw people in. Never mind. You used to have to go into the library, decode the Dewey Decimal System, ask a librarian for help, and go into these musty shelves looking for old pieces of paper with curled edges. That's how you did your research. But think of it now. Everything that would took hours to do back then, you can do with a couple of taps with your fingers right now, and everybody in the world can do it. This is a phenomenal change in the development of knowledge and its sharing right around the world, and will have incredible impacts in the fourth generation. Constant online communications. We know this is happening, and this will be a theme of the talk this evening. You can't find anybody, except in this classroom, without a phone in their hands talking or looking up something. Communications are happening continuously. And with the availability of internet everywhere and constant communications, we're seeing these new corporate structures and work patterns start to evolve. I think the easiest way to describe a virtual company and its characteristics is to compare it to a traditional company in the third generation, which everybody's familiar with. A third generation tech company, it's got an office, bricks and mortar. It's spending money on leases, significant investments in fixed assets, high overhead costs. When they hire, predominantly they're hiring within the local community. You've all been out for interviews, I'm sure, in the last little while. And people have to commute to and from the office in order to get to work. So we're all familiar with that paradigm. The virtual paradigm is quite a bit different in the fourth generation. There's no head office, as we've talked about, so no investment in leases, very minimal investments in fixed assets. Overhead costs are low. Virtual companies hire globally right from the first day, and there's no commuting. People work from anywhere they want to, whether it's their office or the local cafe down the street. In fact, there's a whole subculture. I'm sure you've seen this. You walk into any cafe, and you'll find a group of people who are working contentedly in front of their laptops. They're not talking to each other, but they're happy to be there with other people. So there's a whole generation of working from anywhere that's happening right now. And that is really what's defining the virtual company. But let's look at some other things that are important with virtual companies. We've talked about the lower expense burden without the need for leases and fixed assets. But what that means is their expenses are lower, and so they're more profitable right out of the gate than a traditional third-generation company of the same size. And because they don't have a high overhead rate, then they're easier to bootstrap. I mean, a lot of these companies can get formed with basically the money you earn on your summer vacations. So easier to bootstrap, you can finance them much more easily. Virtual companies are also nimble. This is really important. Because they're not constrained by any geography, real estate, physical assets, or the need to finance very much, they can scale much more easily. And if they're hiring people around the world, then the workday extends by the people who are working on different time zones, which can be good or it can be bad if you're trying to get some sleep at night. But again, constant online communications, this makes them more nimble. And what this does, it leads to faster decisions and more nimbler responses to crises or opportunities as they arise. And that means that virtual companies can scale quite quickly and disrupt established industries, much as Klaus Schwab said would happen in the fourth revolution. And it's happening now. I mean, you look at the contortions that the big banks are turning themselves into to try and adapt to the digital world. They're actually doing not too bad a job at it, but it is so different from the staid-old commercial banking that you used to see. Virtual companies have no geographic restrictions. And this is interesting, too, because what it means is that they can attract the best employees from around the world. It's easier to do now with constant communications and high-speed connections, video conferencing tools. It becomes a much easier process. And it works both ways, because the best employees in the world also want to work with leading-edge virtual companies that are doing new and great things with great people. It's nice to be part of an elite group. So you probably find that that they want to come and work for virtual companies that are on the leading edge. And given the communications that are possible with LinkedIn groups and other social media connections, good people can find each other fairly quickly. And that's why it's much easier to get a company up and running in a virtual mode than in a traditional mode. Employees prefer to work virtually, and the reasons for this are pretty obvious. I mean, anything to avoid that soul-sucking commute to and from the office every day. I mean, the average commute time in the Valley, I think, is now about an hour and a half, and it's not much better if you're trying to come in from Surrey into campus. God, does anybody have to do that? I mean, I just can't imagine. I mean, having to spend an hour and a half each way in your car every day, week in, week out, it's destroying. So to be able to recover, that 2 to 3 hours of commute time every day and invest it in your families, your hobbies, other things that are more fun, I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? And of course, if you're parking your car, then you're not emitting greenhouse gases, so it's a lot more environmentally sustainable to work virtually. Virtual workers have flexible hours. They can work when they want, when the need is there, or book off when they've got to take their kids to school. And this provides a better work-life balance, especially for young families with young children, and in particular for women. And as a society, we've been struggling for about 2 generations now, trying to find the best way that women can enter the workforce and pursue their careers to their maximum extent, but at the same time still allowing enough time and energy to raise a family. And we haven't got the answers to that yet, but I'm betting that with more virtual work that is going to provide some of the answers for some of the people. I think it's certainly a step in the right direction. And there's significantly lower work-related expenses when you're working virtually. You can park the car, we've already talked about that, but you also don't need as big a wardrobe, you're not coming and going to the dry cleaners quite as often, and it's a lot easier and cheaper to make lunch in the kitchen next door than to go to a restaurant. So there's all kinds of advantages for working virtually. And as we thought about some of this, sitting around the shop at Strategic Exits, well, actually, we're a virtual company, too. We just get together on Zoom whenever we want to have a chat, and it works out pretty well. But in the third generation, raising capital was everything. I mean, he who had the gold made the rules. And so companies were completely subservient to the people who provided capital, angels, venture capitalists, banks, that type of thing. But in the fourth generation, with virtual companies needing a whole lot less money, and in this current environment, this crazy financial environment we're living in right now, where capital is in plentiful supply, all of a sudden it's becoming a lot less valuable, financial capital, because you don't need as much of it, and there's lots of it around. By contrast, though, human capital is becoming a lot more important. The job of a virtual company is to engage the best employees worldwide and leverage their knowledge and their motivation, their skills, and their energy and ideas into creating something of great value. But what that means is that in the fourth revolution, the human capital is more important than financial capital. And I think that's the first time you can say that in about 400 years. Money used to rule. Now it's knowledge. Some tremendous changes that are happening. There are some aspects of managing virtual companies that we should pay attention to. First of all, you have to hire experienced people. Now, time was back when I was working in early stage tech companies, helping to found them. We often hired, intelligent people straight out of school with no experience, because we believed that what they lacked in maturity and wisdom, they more than made up for in energy and creativity. And we could. I mean, you could develop a very successful tech company with very young people. The first one I worked for, the average age was 27, and it stayed that way for 7 years, which meant that as people were getting older, we were continuing to hire younger people in behind them. And that company grew to be a tremendous success, 300 people. It was one of the, Nexus Engineering, it was one of the early successes started by a PhD student here at UBC, who actually also happens to be one of my partners in Strategic Exits. So constant communications, that term comes up again. In order to keep your company live and fresh and to keep everybody engaged, there is a need for constant communications all of the time, which is good for building the team and the culture and involving as many people as you can in making important decisions, which helps gel the team together. But it comes at a cost. Constant communications means constant disruption. And so if you're going to get any work done, then you need some kind of structure and protocol around your communication system so that you can get something done while you're doing all of this communicating, which is so important. And the other thing to note is that working virtually is not for everybody. Many employees, thrive on face-to-face interaction with people who they come to work with every day. For instance, my wife told me, she said she'd never work for a virtual company because she wouldn't be able to talk to anybody. The point is that you have to choose your people wisely, because this role is not for everybody. Just as a sidebar, we're seeing another feature emerge, and that is the rise of the digital nomads. Have you run across this before? Yeah? Okay. When you work from anywhere, what that permits is a new breed of employee who, in fact, takes us to its extreme and actually doesn't live anywhere. With no fixed address, they're not resident of any country. They're constantly traveling, living in Airbnb or VRBOs. And, it's not a lifestyle I would want, but for many people, it's pretty exciting. It gives them total flexibility in their work and their lifestyle. You don't like the weather? Hop a plane. You can go somewhere else and plug in as soon as the plane lands. But more importantly, it allows digital nomads to organize their travel and their work to minimize the taxes that they pay. And so there's a real financial incentive for going that way if you can do it. I mentioned that as investment bankers, we're always interested in what the implications are for mergers and acquisitions. And the virtual company concept has a few. And I'm going to touch on valuation, tax planning, reducing regulatory expenses, how to grind a deal through in a virtual company acquisition, acquisition integration after the deal is closed, and then I'll finish off with a case study on a virtual company that we sold recently. So first up is tax. Tax planning is a huge value. In fact, it's probably the most important part of doing an acquisition. Now, an investment banker's job is to maximize the after-tax value of exits to the sellers, obviously. And there's two components to this. One is negotiating the highest price and due consideration of risk and timing. But the other part is making sure that they keep as much of it as possible, and that's by lowering their tax burden. And if you don't do it well, the government can end up being the biggest winner in an exit transaction by taking 20 to 40% of the gross price through payment of taxes on dividends or on capital gains. So if you can structure yourself to minimize or erase those, you're adding another chunk of value to your client who's selling the company. Now, here's the point is that international virtual companies have more options to lower their taxes because they can register in a tax-friendly jurisdiction. I mean, when you set up a virtual company, you don't have to domicile it here in BC or in Canada. You can pick the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands or anywhere that companies are formed and take advantage of the beneficial tax structures that they have in those countries. Virtual companies can do that. Traditional companies, it's a lot harder. So, on the one hand, it adds value. On the other hand, it's extremely complex. Any cross-border transaction is significantly, an order of magnitude, more complex than trying to do one within the jurisdiction of a single country. And that's because very few mergers and acquisition lawyers understand tax law in a foreign jurisdiction. I mean, you've probably seen the tax code is like this deep and it gets deeper every year. It's very hard to understand all of those arcane details and to keep track of the changes from year to year. Hard enough in one jurisdiction and virtually impossible to try and do it in more than one. So what that means is that you've got an international cross-border M&A transaction, then you need a tax team in each jurisdiction to collaborate on putting the final structure together. And while this is complicated, it's really fun for the tax lawyers because they often get a chance to break new ground on new international tax structures that haven't been tried before, which is great. And it can add a lot of value by saving on taxes, but it comes at a risk that if it's too complicated and too murky, the taxation authority may want to take another look at it, and that's something that you really don't want them to do. So the final structure needs to balance the value that you're creating by the savings in taxes versus the risk that it may come under review. Virtual companies can also save a lot on some of the regulatory burdens that traditional companies have. And it's becoming increasingly, more of a drag to do international business these days because of the trade and political environment that we're in internationally. And I think you know all about the rising trade barriers that are happening, and threats of shutting borders. All of these kinds of things are throwing sand in the wheels of getting transactions done. I mean, antitrust has been with us forever. That's a review to make sure that you're not reducing overly the amount of competition in a workspace by doing a transaction between two major players. But international trade sanctions are caught up. Tech companies are caught up in this because they have valuable technology that the one country wants to retain in its borders, the other country wants to acquire for its purposes. A lot of this high technology development is around the area of security. I mean, we all know the story of Huawei is in the papers every day, and countries are trying to keep their IP close to home. So those are all the problems of a traditional company trying to conduct an M&A transaction. But a virtual company that's domiciled in an unaffected jurisdiction is flying underneath the radar and can avoid most of these challenges right from the outset. So another value for virtual companies. And that's what brings us to the point I was making at the outset, is that I think that at Strategic Exits, we've discovered that virtual companies are worth more. And we've talked about the reasons for that. Their human capital generally is better because they're recruiting from around the world. They're more nimble because they're smaller. They can grow faster and scale quickly. They can take advantage much more quickly than stodgy big companies can. They're more profitable right out of the gate. And they can register in low-tax jurisdictions to avoid taxes and avoid a lot of the regulatory impediments. So for all of these reasons, a virtual company versus a traditional company the same size, the virtual company is worth more. And then as an added benefit, particularly to guys like me who end up having to grind these deals through, is that virtual companies are also easier to acquire. The diligence is easier to conduct, and the integration of the acquired company post-deal is much easier to execute as well. I'm going to tell you about a case study of a company that we sold recently that actually brought in a lot of these themes. It was a data analytics company, and unfortunately we're under tight NDA, so I can't tell you more than that. But it was founded by a millennial digital nomad. He liked to describe himself as Airbnb's best customer because he was constantly traveling. We used to have a game around the office at Exis to try and figure out where the hell he was at any point in time, because he could be talking to us one afternoon with one background and the next afternoon with an entirely different background, wearing different clothes, from a parka to a safari shirt. I think he moved. He would never tell us. We just had to try and guess. But that's the life he lived. He would move every few days. He'd just plug in and start managing the company when he got close to an internet connection. And he did a hell of a job at it, too. He was able to, his team, complete the software development and launch their application inside of a year. And inside of 3 years, he grew to 40 virtual employees. He did this by paying particular attention to how he built the team. And we talked about the experience of digital nomads. He used this quite extensively. He hired his team of experienced nomads that had experience, have been around the block a few times. They knew something about software development, so they could basically plug into the company and get going and be productive reasonably quickly and without a lot of supervision. So that worked very well. The second thing he did was he made sure he hired only the best developers. If you couldn't demonstrate that you could crack great code within a week, you were gone. So he made sure that he had the best developers working for him, again, recruited from around the world. So with that, he developed a team of very smart, self-starting, responsible, and accountable people who didn't need a whole lot of oversight. And that was really the key to making this company successful. But time was a-wasting, and after 2 years, he figured it's, the company's quickly growing, it's highly profitable, this is a good time to sell. And in my other job as an investment banker, that's another slide we have, is that the best time to sell your company is when it's growing very quickly, not when it's growing as far as it can. And in the question period, I can tell you why that is. But he realized it, and so went to look for an investment banker to help him sell the company. And he chose the Strategic Exits for two reasons. One, that we were compatible with the virtual lifestyle. We used the same tools that he did. We could connect online through Zoom quicker than he could, so he liked that. And the fact that all of us had worked for decades in the technology industry means that we sort of had a communal spirit of what it's like to work in a fast-growing, uncertain technical world. So we related to each other particularly well, and we got along like a house of fire. So then it was time to do our job. We went out and researched the world looking for the best buyer for this company. And we found a private equity acquirer with domain expertise. It's a massive accumulation of wealth which buys companies, improves them by grinding out costs and expanding revenue so they can be sold several years later at a 3x return. And there's huge, there must be trillions of dollars that are tied up in private equity funds right now. Anyway, we found one that knew the space that our company was in, and they particularly liked this company because the founder had bootstrapped it right from startup. He'd assembled a strong team. The company was growing very quickly and had made an immediate impact on a very large market. So they perceived the value, and they made an unbeatable offer. When I picked up the phone and he told me what they were offering, I dropped the phone. I had to pick it up and make sure I heard the right number again. But they wanted to shut out everybody else from bidding on this because they saw the value for themselves. So they signed a letter of intent with a commitment to close in 60 days, which was rather remarkable because if you've ever been involved in an M&A transaction, it can take a lot longer than 60 days. It can take months. But these guys were so sure of what they were doing that they made a commitment to close in 60 days. So we decided to hold them to it. As it happened, it really wasn't as much trouble as we thought. The due diligence was pretty simple. That's because as a virtual company, they didn't have a whole lot of records of any kind, but what they did was all electronic. So instead of the normal thing you see of companies in the third generation plowing through the filing cabinets looking for paper documents and scanning them and trying to organize them, which can take weeks and months, we actually assembled a virtual data room on Dropbox. They populated it within days, and the buyer finished reviewing them within a week. So this is, that was quite a revelation as to the power of making things organized and digital, which is what a virtual company is all about. Now we come to the site visit. And in most typical deals, this is the pivotal moment in a transaction when the buyer comes in to do due diligence face-to-face with the principals of the company that he's buying. And typically, every moment, every conversation has to be choreographed from the outset, from the time the buyer's plane touches ground until they take off again 2 days later, because you want to present the best face of the company and avoid any unnecessary mistakes which could create a deal. But then we had a problem, of course, because there was no site to visit. There's no head office. So how are we going to manage this? So we looked at the map and figured out the highest concentration of virtual employees and said, well, let's just do it there. And so we flew the management team and the buyer flew their diligence team and descended on this city. We holed up in a hotel room for 2 days, where we got all of the questions asked and answered. But importantly, and this was a revelation to us, the most important part of that was the informal dinners and lunches that we had where people were talking less formally, and the two teams could get to know each other because they were going to have to be working together for a few years, so they needed to assess that they were compatible. So it was very successful from that point of view. The diligence was done in record time. Now, when it came to grinding the deal, which is papering all of the legal documents that are required for an acquisition, this was particularly complex because there were 3 jurisdictions involved, not just 2. And so we knew we had to get very experienced M&A counsel. We chose them for their cross-border experience, so at least we could avoid that part of the learning curve. And the buyers and the sellers assembled teams of tax lawyers, one for each jurisdiction. So at one point, I think we had a conference call with 24 lawyers on it, and I was just trying to calculate how much that was costing per minute for the buyers and the sellers to fund this. But they worked hard, and they were very successful. It was a complex transaction that broke new ground. But we calculate that the sellers gained an additional 25% from going through this process, which is, makes it worthwhile. What particularly impressed me was how good these lawyers were. I've seen transactions that take weeks to push the paper back and forth till it's finally in a form that people are ready to sign it. These lawyers were able to generate hundreds of documents in the space of a couple of days and have them reviewed and be ready for execution within inside of a week. I've never seen anything like that before. But as a result, they were able to close this transaction not in 60 days, but in 40 days. And, I'll do business with those guys any time. They were expensive, but they got the job done. It was well worthwhile. Finally, with the deal nearing completion, the buyer wanted to relocate the company to the United States. As exciting as virtual companies and digital nomads are, they wanted to get into something that they understood, which was standardized employment agreements and familiar regulations and systems. So they insisted that the company relocate into the United States. So even before the deal was done, our team was researching cities around the United States, and they found a small progressive city with an established tech hub. It was a nice place to live, and very importantly, it had no state income tax. So they were able to take the lessons we taught them of finding a jurisdiction with no income tax, and you can put more money in your pocket. So the digital nomads and the virtual workers all relocated, and this transition happened within weeks of close. And I attribute that to the fact that having worked as virtual employees for so long, they were used to constant communications, and so they could share ideas and get the nature of what the new company is much faster than those that had never been through it before. So it worked particularly well. So we considered it a very successful sale. This company was bootstrapped with no investment at the outset. They developed and launched their analytics application within a year. We successfully sold them in their third year, and the deal value was over 125 million Canadian. So we think that was a pretty good success story all around, and we were happy to be part of it. So that's the presentation, and we'll throw the session open to questions. I'm sorry. I should have introduced Nick Pindred, who's a 2018 graduate of material science at UBC. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So he's going to be handling the mic. If you got a question, stick up your hand. He'll bring the mic to you, and I'll do my best to answer them. So fire away.
You talked about unaffected jurisdictions. What are your most preferred unaffected jurisdictions?
Well, those that have very few regulations and very simple tax codes.
Can you give examples?
What can I give you? Well, sure, the British Virgin Islands, the Cook Islands. There's all kinds of places like that.
So
there are also European countries too. I mean, there's an awful lot of business that goes through Luxembourg, far more than you would predict for a company of that small size. So, there are various jurisdictions all around the world where it's easier to do business.
Thank you. You said something that was intriguing, and that was that virtual companies are worth much more than, third generation but can you articulate how much more on average in your experience?
Not really. No, I mean, it's on a case-by-case basis. The fact that we were able to sell a 40-person company in its third year of existence for 125 million Canadian, that's a pretty good deal, and largely it was due to the fact that they were a virtual company, and were able to hire the best people from around the world, so they were able to get their development done more quickly. They formed a very cohesive team because they were in constant communications all of the time. This is what the buyer liked, was the capability of the team. The fact that they were nimble and able to respond quickly to crises and opportunities. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's worth value, but I can't put a dollar figure on it. I just look at the result and say it must have worked.
Last question. I'm just wondering, something you said as well is that the tax structure in the deal allowed them to gain an extra 25%. Can you give us core elements of what that tax structure was?
It was very complex, but what it involved was selling assets from a low-tax jurisdiction so that the capital gain was accrued in a low-tax jurisdiction place so that capital gains didn't have to be paid, and selling the assets through a second company that had a tax treaty with the United States so that when the assets finally ended up in the United States, there was less concern about the tax implications because the transaction was done between two tax treaty countries that knew each other very well. So that's it in essence.
You mentioned during your presentation that it's better to sell the company while there's a period of rapid growth rather than later on. So can you explain why? Sure, because when you're in the middle of, let me just draw a little picture here. I'm sure all of you have seen this S-curve in many connotations, right? Company founding here hits the rapid growth phase and then starts to top out and eventually either here, sometimes it gets bought, but sometimes it fails. But the best time to sell is right here, not right here. And the reason is because you're growing more rapidly, you get a higher multiple on your revenue or your earnings or whatever the features that's being used to value the company. It's always better to be showing rapid growth because, in their mind's eyes, as they start to glean, the buyers start to do this, even though the reality is this. So what you don't want to do ever is ride it over the top and start your selling process here saying, hey, it's as much as it's going to get, so time to sell. Because what happens is you ride it over the top and you're chasing a downward trend here, and sometimes bad things happen. That's a bomb going off. Does that answer it for you?
So I'm looking to start a company, a digital company, specifically targeting the Latin American market. Mm-hmm. But but due to different like tax structures that are in Latin America that pose a very, very heavy barrier of entry, is it possible for setting up the company legally in the United States or in Canada and then running the company targeting that market?
That's what I've been alluding to. Yes.
And then how would you go about selling it?
Well, let me give you my business card, and we can have a chat afterwards. Yeah, it's selling a company is a complex thing. There's an awful lot that goes into it. The timing has to be right. All of the pieces have to be there, as this company was. Everything was lining up, and sometimes it can take a year to 2 years from the time the investment banker starts working with the company until it's actually in a position that it can be sold. So, each case is individual, but what Strategic Exits does, and will be the subject of some more research papers that we're preparing, is that we will often work with an earlier stage company before they're ready to be sold to help them with their business development and their strategy, so that all the pieces start to line up before we try and sell the company. So, the company has to do its work first before we can do our work.
Just to follow up to the growth question about you should be selling your company when you're on a projection of growth. How do you know when you've reached that point, or how do you know when you're at a point where you should sell and you're not too late?
That's a very good question. Well, if the orders are coming in faster than you can fill them, if your company is starting to strain at the edges because there's just so much happening, that tells you that you got to do one of two things. Either you got to expand, grow, which in the traditional case means raising more money, or look to sell at that point. And it used to be, the mantra was right from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, grow your company, keep it growing. Don't worry about the exit, because if you do a right job growing your company, the exit will find you. That's been proven to be almost completely fallacious. It doesn't work that way, because this is what happens. If you're growing really quickly and finding a hard time to keep up, if you've got a strong base of revenues that you can predict going forward what they're going to look like, if you're starting to show some profits and indeed can predict a profit stream like this, these are the things that you need to fill in order to be ready for an exit. So, I can't give you a definitive idea. It's different for every country, for every company, but those are the things you want to look for.
How did you guys come up with 125? Is there kind of a rule of thumb for a growth rate or revenues?
It was a multiple on EBITDA.
What was the multiple?
Not telling, it's a secret.
Okay. And then,
but it was a good one.
how do investment bankers get compensated? Is it a cut of the deal? It's
a cut of the deal.
Okay.
Right. So
is there an industry average, or?
No, they typically can run from the low single digits for very large companies up to low double digits for small or difficult deals. So we have a protocol that we work towards. It's different than other investment bankers do, but you'll find typically that all of them work for a percentage of the deal. There may be a small work fee up front just to make sure that everybody's got a little bit of skin in the game, but in the end, you're paid for your performance. And unfortunately, if the deals don't close, you don't get paid, and from time to time that happens. In fact, it happens quite a bit. So you enjoy the wonderful deals because they make up for the ones that don't go so well.
How do you hire employees as a virtual company? Like, are there restrictions if you're incorporating out of the Cayman Islands, where people can work in the world and with what?
No, that's the brilliant thing about working virtually. There are no restrictions. I mean, you can set up shop in your bedroom in Antigua, or down at the coffee shop down the road. You're working with people. They can they pay you, but they probably pay you as a contractor. And it's going to be up to the individual to make sure that they're abiding by the employment law within the country of jurisdiction. That's the key point here. Is as a virtual company, we hire you. We'll help you to make sure that you're not violating any of your employment rules, but it's up to you to know what they are.
And how should the employees be compensated to maximize productivity? Because I feel like since they're not present, there may be the hourly timesheets might not be the best idea.
I didn't delve into that too deeply with this company, but typically employees are paid by the hour, and in the tech industry, to keep everybody interested and motivated, there's usually an equity component that comes along with it. At least in even the third generation and fourth generation companies too. There's got to be a reason for getting out of bed and wandering next door to your office and working for 12 hours. There's got to be a sense that not only are you building something great, but it's going to be worth something for you personally at the end of the day. So the answer is, I think, equity. Which is not to say you don't pay them in cash as well. I'm saying there's a balance here. You've got to, they got to buy groceries, but their winnings, their earnings, their big potential comes from the payoff when the company's sold. Yeah.
For hardware companies that sell online, so physical products, have you seen a situation where they could have either chosen to do a licensing deal or an exit?
Well, let me say first of all that, and I should have said this at the very outset, that virtual companies only really work when everything's online, when you're developing software or web applications. If you're a hardware manufacturer, you have physical assets. People have to be there unless everything's robotically controlled from somewhere in Nevada. But generally, you got to be there. So the virtual system doesn't work for hardware manufacturing. Now, I think the second part of your question is it better to sell the company or to license? Sell, sell, sell. There's just no question about that, because licensing deals, you might get a few percentage points on the revenue, but when you add up, what that's likely to look like over a period of time compared to selling the company, it's a fraction. And the other nasty part about licensing is that companies, acquiring companies don't mind paying them for the first couple of years. But after that, they get kind of tired of writing these checks every year when they're not seeing anything coming back from them. And they typically will look for a way to get out of the royalty payment by adapting the product slightly so it's no longer yours. So I'm not a big fan of licensing deals, no.
So you mentioned that the virtual company has the advantages of better tax maneuvering. They're more nimble, they have lower costs, and they have access to this global talent. And obviously, from the case study, they're also more lucrative for selling after like 2-3 years.
You take notes very quickly, don't you?
Do my best, yeah. So how does that structure play out for sustaining like a strong team culture or running larger operations as the company grows and matures?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we've looked at that in some of our research. There was a survey done of about 25 virtual companies, most of them based in the US. This was done a couple of years ago, and I looked at it fairly closely, and what was interesting to me is that out of that 25, there was one company that had 125 employees, but it was basically a tax preparation shop, so every job was the same as every other job. You could scale that infinitely. Of the rest, very few had more than 50 or 60 employees. And I didn't have time to get into it in this discussion, but I think there's an open question here that I'd like to do some more work on is there a maximum size for a virtual company, given the amount of communications that has to happen? At some point, it gets too unwieldy. So, back in the third generation, when we were founding bricks and mortars companies, we found that the number of about 300 employees was about the optimum, the biggest size for any single plant. You could have multiple plants, but within any plant, about 300 was the right size. You could, know what people were doing on a day-to-day basis and involve people in decisions. There wasn't the sense of alienation that can come with a larger company. Translating that to a virtual company, I don't know if the number is 60, but it's curious to me that nobody seemed to be above that number. And if you think about it, doing a Zoom conference calls, how many can you effectively do? It was interesting. I was up at Whistler on the weekend and rode the T-bar with a woman. We got to talking. It turns out that she is a virtual employee of a environmental nonprofit. And so I asked her the question, how big's your company? She said 65. And I said, and 12 countries around the world. I said, could it get any bigger? She says, well, no, because we need to get everybody together at least once a year. It starts to get expensive when there's more than 60 employees, but you can't really have an effective conference call when you're trying to see, 60 different faces on a screen. So my sense is that that's where it's going, but, this is early stage yet. We really don't know.
Hi, you mentioned that the diligence that you have to do is easier for virtual companies. And I was wondering if you could explain that, because I thought it would be the opposite. If they don't have physical assets and there's higher risk of fraud, and it's also easier to inflate the assets of the company.
Well, that's interesting. Fraud.
Never thought about that. Well, one thing's for sure is that no company gets bought, unless there's an audit done of the financial statements. So, I mean, you do devolve, and if you can get one of the big four to do it, so much the better. The middle tier is also probably perfectly acceptable, but you do need to have an audit. And more than an audit, sometimes you need a quality of earnings report. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but what that does is it takes the audit one step further and looks at the composition of the revenue and the expenses to see which ones are reproducible over a long period of time. So it, and there's the diligence that happens by talking to the customers as well. So, I mean, there is the potential for fraud, I suppose, but if the professionals are doing their job, they should be able to uncover it pretty well. And the idea that the diligence is easier when it's electronic, what I was referring to is the fact that whatever your records are, if they're electronic, it's very easy to populate them into a data room that's organized by category and to review them. And I was comparing and contrasting that to the old system of having to go through dusty file cabinets going back 4 or 5 years looking for some licensing agreement that was long gone and forgotten, but maybe still was relevant. That is really what slows down a lot of traditional M&A, and it's just really not a part of the virtual company because they're much better organized from the get-go.
My question was, other than focusing on virtual companies, what is uniquely special about your company when these startups are choosing the right intermediary investment banking companies to exit with?
So you'd like our commercial then? Okay. Well, I think I alluded to it in why this company chose us. All of the principals have had decades of experience in starting and running technology companies. So, we know where it's at. We've been there before. We've seen the struggles of running out of money. We've seen the excitement of the new sale running in, getting a financing done so we can actually make the next payroll in lickety-split time. So all of the perils and the excitement, I mean, we know all of that. And so we can relate to technology entrepreneurs, on a one-to-one basis. You contrast that with most investment bankers, and if you can go on their websites, you look at them, they sell everything from soup to nuts and high tech too, but they don't have that same knowledge base of domain experience within the industry. Plus, having done this for a while, the other thing we can, I think, glean is we can understand, technology strategy, better, I think, than those that aren't in that domain. And I was alluding to this earlier that this is what we can do with companies, is to find them at an early stage, when they're not really ready to be sold yet. They're still working things out. And one of my colleagues is going to be writing a set of papers on this, is how business development intersects with investment banking. You can actually help prepare the company by filling in a lot of those loose ends, helping them develop a strategy that is going to resonate with a potential buyer, so they're more likely to buy the company. So what distinguishes us is the amount of time that we will put into a company before it's ready to sell. Typically, with other companies, that's zero. I mean, they just want to flip something as quickly as they can and get on to the next deal. We don't do that. I mean, we invest in our clients. We understand how they work, and we also put a hell of a lot of effort into it. When we go to look for a buyer, it would not be unusual for us to canvass 1,000 companies. We'll look at 1,000, we'll discard 800 of them, but then we'll look very closely at 200, and then dwindle it down from there to contact probably between 50 and 100. Physical contact, and we'll work like 7 times on the phone just to finally get somebody on the line. So, we work really hard at it. And we think that provides the best opportunity for our clients to get the best value for their company. So that's how we distinguish ourselves. And part of why I'm here tonight is that we're also developing some thought leadership and some other emerging trends, of which virtual companies we see as one, because we like to distinguish ourselves as being not just investment bankers of any kind, but those that are have a vested interest in the technology industry and committed to it, and developing some thought leadership that shows that we maybe know a little bit more about the industry than some other investment bankers. So.
Just kind of follow up. Like during the negotiation stages, how much flexibility does these startups have when choosing the buyers? Because I'd imagine if they get loads of offers from different size of buyers, different complexities kind of involved depending on the size, the different strategies that these buyers may have. Do you guys just go after the biggest checks, or is it finding the one with the best fit? And how does that kind of stage transpires over the time?
That phrase at the end, do you have to take the best deal? I read a book on this just a little while ago. I think it was Bo Bellingham's book, Finish Big. And he came to halfway through the book and saw this thing I'd never realized before. But it's different in the United States than in Canada. In the U.S., your job is to maximize the return to the shareholders, full stop. And so that means you have to take the best deal on offer in the United States, because that's your fiduciary duty. In Canada, it's different. Your fiduciary duty is to serve the best interests of the company. And that may not be by taking the best offer. It may be taking a slightly lower offer, but ensuring that all of your employees are going to be hired and retained, post-deal. So there's a lot of considerations that can go into choosing the best company. But, it would be a glorious situation to have so many offers sitting on the table to pick and choose amongst them. That's an ideal scenario. It's part of our job to try and arrange that. But, timings are different depending upon when you get a hold of people. It's not always that easy to do. But it certainly is our job to, analyze any offer that comes in, explain its advantages and disadvantages across a range of criteria for our seller. Ultimately, it's our client that makes the decision. We're just there to advise. And, if we can fully explain all of the aspects of it, then that's the job that we have to do.
So I'm sure that you have prospective clients. Are there any red flags or variables that if you see in a client, you'll absolutely not work for them?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
During most of 2019, we were working fairly closely with 4 or 5 different companies. We're not working with any of them right now because, they tripped over a line that, that made us believe that we weren't going to be able to give them the success that they wanted. And there's all kinds of things that, that work into this, but I'll just share one with you. And it's the subject of, by the way, if Strategic Exits ever comes around and gives one of their lectures on exit planning or exit execution, you should go to it because, that's the venue where we explore a lot of these different considerations. But the consideration that's number one for us is alignment. And that is that before you start an exit, you have to be sure that all of the stakeholders agree with the strategy and the desired outcome. That means the management team, the founders, the board, and any other influential stakeholders like husbands and wives who may have a big interest in what happens with the company. And if we do that by asking a lot of questions up front, and if we determine that there really isn't an alignment there, then we'll pass. Because we know from experience that something bad will happen. We'll go through the process and go a long way through the process, and we're getting to the point where we have to make decisions. And all of a sudden, all of the unspoken objections start to well up, and then you realize that you got a disaster on your hands that you really can't sell the company. I like to tell the story of when I was running a new chemical company that developed a whole range of non-VOC solvents, which were so much better for the atmosphere. We couldn't understand why everybody didn't want to buy one, but they didn't. Anyway, we were doing our exit planning, and I got my partner. I wasn't with Strategic Exits at the time. I was running this company. But my partner, Basil Peters, was running it. And I've known him since he was in grad school here in the 70s, so we were quite close. And we went through the process of bringing him on as our investment banker. And subsequently, we took investment from some angels, and we brought them up to speed. We had a dinner where we explored all of the options and the reasons why we wanted to go this particular route. He was nodding his head going, yep. But for several months after that, it became clear to me whenever the subject of the acquisition or a sale would come up, he'd be very evasive and not very committal. And so eventually one time I had it out with him. I said, it doesn't sound to me like you actually are supporting this plan. He says, no, I'm not. I think it's a stupid idea. And I said, well, okay, we did this for all good reasons. You were there at the table, but if this is not something you're comfortable with, then there's no point in us continuing. So that afternoon, I had to phone up my best buddy, Basil, and fire him. Oh, that was a lot of fun. But it's critical. And you'll see the issue of alignment come up in so many things. It's fine for people to disagree and have good and valid reasons for disagreeing with a particular plan of action. But at the end of the day, once the decision is made and you move forward, then you have to wholeheartedly support it, or you have to find something else to do. In the case when you're dealing with a board member, that's a little bit different because they're there for a reason. And, you have to decide if you want to push something like this through. It's going to be a lot of heartache, and it's best not done.
So in the case of the case study company here, you said that it was kind of like an acquisition hire, an acqui-hire.
No, it was not an acqui-hire.
Okay. So the employees, I thought you said that they joined the firm when they were purchased?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, the company became one of the portfolio companies in the private equity organization. So it retained its identity, but its ownership was within that private equity fund.
Understood. Okay, so I guess, do you see a lot of that sort of structure happen, or have you seen kind of like these larger virtual companies lose a lot of their workforce when they're acquired? What tends to happen with, I guess, the founding level, like the C-level executives of the virtual company? Do they get kind of acqui-hired or not? Or is it typically like an IP transfer?
Okay, so I want to make sure that we're talking in the same terms. To me, an acqui-hire is one where there's not a lot of value in the company and its products and its revenue stream, but in fact, all of the value is in the people that show up for work every day, or virtually, as the case may be. And there are some rules of thumb. I've seen that an acqui-hire could be valued at $1 million to $1.5 million per active engineer. But that's really selling a company in its pieces. You're pulling the pieces apart and selling them one at a time, and that's not creating great value for your client. Not like selling a 40-person company for $125 million. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. So, what happens post-close? Well, you're all students of business administration, so I'm sure you know that the success rate of acquisitions is not as good as it should be. It's getting much better than it was, because the acquiring companies have finally begun to realize that companies can look good together on paper, but unless their cultures are lining up and the people feel good to coming work every day and that they're respected, things start to fall apart. And back in the 70s and 80s, probably 85% of acquisitions didn't achieve their desired results for those reasons, that the two cultures weren't compatible. But I think that's understood now. And the advantage of a virtual company is because they've had to glean and learn from each other over a long distance video connection. My theory is that they're better able to understand how to integrate with the new culture of the company that's bought them. I could be wrong about that. I mean, there isn't a lot of history to this point in time to see the long-term effects of the acquiring of a virtual company. But I would put money on it right now that it's probably more successful than a traditional acquisition.
All right. Please join me in thanking David.
Oh, thank you.